Welcome to the Red Dead Podcast, where we'll be exploring the trials and triumphs of being a father, men's mental health, and any other topic that inspires us to be rad. Through a series of interviews, your host, Jace Kelly, will be discussing and discovering the best ways to become a rad dad. Now your host, Jace.
All right, welcome to the Rad Dad Podcast. This is episode 15. I have Dane K here. Dane, we've known each other for over 2 decades.
Yeah, I'd say 23, 24 years probably.
Yeah, a long time. So you probably don't know this, but when I first started the podcast, the idea came to me in the middle of the night, and I got on my notes on my phone. I started writing down people, and there's 15 original people, and you were one of them.
Oh.
So I'm glad to have you on. Definitely wanted to get a few episodes under my belt because you're Dane K, you gotta look as professional as possible. Just to start off though, tell me a little bit about like your upbringing, where you grew up and what your childhood was like.
I grew up in southern Idaho in a little town called Hayburn on the banks of the Snake River, just across from Burley. It's an agricultural community, everything there revolves around, farming and agriculture. It was a great place to grow up. Yeah, my mom and my dad were not farmers, although I did have lots of opportunities to work on farms. I hauled hay and moved pipe and milked cows and, that kind of stuff. But my mom was a postmaster in the little town there. My dad was a welder. A little bit of what made my growing up years probably maybe not as unique as it should be, as my dad was an alcoholic. And we had kind of that situation to kind of navigate as we grew up. Another thing that happened is I had an older brother named Mitch that was killed on a bike when he was 7. And, so that kind of created some family dynamics, around grief at certain times. Because I think when parents go through that kind of traumatic ordeal, and probably especially back then, where they didn't necessarily know, that how to get help for that really in terms of grief counseling or that sort of thing. It was, I wouldn't say grief was ever present, in our family culture, but we were always mindful that there was an empty chair at the table. So, but, my dad, despite his alcoholism, he was a good man. He emulated a lot of the attributes from, the type of character he was that were important, hard work and honesty and those kinds of things. But, when he joined the Navy, when he was 18 years old,
Wow.
and he went over to, to do his duty. And like so many of those, kids who went over and did that, he ended up, starting to smoke and drink. And it's kind of ironic when you think about it, that generation, so many of those went over there and preserved our freedom, but maybe lost a little bit of their personal freedom as it came to substance abuse, Yeah. So anyway, growing up in that environment certainly shaped me, but I had a happy childhood. My mom was just an incredible woman. And, she did a terrific job with, 7 kids and missing my one that was the 8th, my brother who was killed. So anyway, I had a happy childhood despite, some trauma and some things that kind of go along with growing up in, in a family of addiction.
Yeah. Was there a moment you can remember in your upbringing where you realized like your dad was an alcoholic, or like maybe this isn't the normal family structure or what goes on in a home? Like yeah, I think it was just ever present for me. I remember, from being a little kid, kind of being aware that we were different, in that sense. And I think it created some things, that in my 50s I started to realize, oh, that's why I'm that way. It was because I had that experience. As a 10-year-old kid, you're laying in bed and you're listening to, what's going on as your dad comes home after a night at the bar, and you're thinking to yourself, like, what can I do? What can I do? And it creates this sense of hyper responsibility, I think, in some kids
that, later in my life, as it turned out, was probably pretty good for an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
But maybe not so good for a 10-year-old kid who couldn't really do much about his dad's addiction.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed in, this process of becoming a dad and just growing up and settling into adulthood is, it seems like every year I realize more and more the hard decisions and bad decisions that my dad made. I'm not saying it justifies those decisions, but I understand it better.
Yeah.
Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think nobody does it perfect. I think you have these delusions of grandeur when you first have a kid that you're never going to make a mistake, right? You're going to raise the perfect kid. You're going to be the perfect dad.
Yeah.
And then life happens and you find out that, you're just as flawed as a dad as you were, before you became a dad, And sometimes it magnifies those tendencies a little bit, where you have to look in the mirror and say, I wish I could do that one over again.
Yeah. And I think parents hold a lot of weight, hold a lot of that guilt maybe, as their kids turn into adults. I remember my parents told me a few years ago, they're like, man, maybe having adult children is harder than having young children because they make their own decisions and you can't help them as much,
Yeah, well, you just get to sit by and watch and, hopefully watch your kids not screw up your grandkids, right? That's what you hope. But no, nobody does it perfect. I mean, the reality is, we're an amalgamation really of three things: our genetics, the family systems and structure that we grow up in, and then the social systems and structure that we're exposed to, and if you think about the developmental process of a kid, and you think about, those three things and how they impact us, we're learning, the brain science is evolving all the time, and we're learning that there are more and more genetic markers for mental health issues than we ever would have imagined, right? The better that we get at it. So if you look at those three things, and by the time you're an adult, those three things largely shape the way you see the world and the way the world sees you. And not everything's obvious that it needs a paradigm shift or an adjustment,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So talk to me about what brought you to Utah.
I had just gotten married. I wanted to, finish school at BYU. I got a finance degree there. So I came down really, after Jan and I got married to finish school. And, I was graduating from the Marriott School of Management, and, interviews were starting, and I was kind of having to decide, okay, this is it. This is what you've gone to school for. And BYU's finance program has had a good reputation for a lot of years. And so there were opportunities, but most of them were, Chicago or New York or the financial centers in the country. And by that time, I had a kid, and I realized, I want to raise my family, here. It felt like home. There's so much to do, and it was away from family so that we could kind of do our own thing, but it was close enough that we could see him. And, so about that same time, my partners and I decided we'd, kind of do this thing. And so we started our own business, and, 30 years later, it worked out pretty well, and we transacted, and I retired in my mid-50s and, really figured out, how much I was missing by working so much.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. It was incredibly rewarding.
So how old were you when you started the business?
25.
So that's pretty young to take a big risk like that.
Yeah.
Did you feel like you were taking a risk, and how did you handle that?
I think that there's kind of the way we're wired, when you're young, you have very little risk aversion. You don't start to get risk averse until you get older and you have something to protect.
That's true. Yeah.
But when you're young and you're dumb and you don't have anything, you don't know. And so really at the time, I mean, you don't really recognize just kind of what you're exposing yourself and your family to. And to be honest, you only have one choice, and that's to make it work.
Yeah.
So you go bust your can and you do what you got to do to make it work. And that was certainly our case. I had, three terrific partners that I love like brothers, and we were fortunate to, have some incredible people that came to work with us in the cause over the years and helped us build, our platform of companies. And so I don't know. I have a lot of fond memories of that experience, and I learned and evolved and developed a lot over that period of time.
So the process of choosing partners, was it you had your core people and then you decided what you were going to start? Or was it the other way around where you already had a business idea and then you needed to find the people?
Well, in all reality, we were working at a secure facility for mentally ill kids.
Okay.
The guy, all of us, and two of the guys, really they had the stones to step up and go start it, and so they went out and but within a couple of months, me and the other one joined them, and we bought out an original partner, and then kind of started to grow up from there. Started with one 16-bed program on Sand Hill Road, just south of UVU, and kind of grew it from there.
So I want to pick your brain a little bit more about these first few years because it's really interesting. But do you want to just explain what your business is?
Yeah, we owned residential treatment programs, for kids. Essentially, we started with Division of Youth Corrections and Division of Family Services contracts. That was how we began. And so we would take kids who were referred to us by caseworkers after they had been put in state's custody, through the juvenile justice system. So that was how we started.
Okay.
We had, several of those programs. And then, we recognized that there was an opportunity in the private pay sector, where kids weren't necessarily in state custody, but they needed help. And, all the research at the time was kind of showing that early intervention, got better results. And so we started our first program, our first private program in 1993, which was a wilderness therapy program down in southern Utah. And then we grew it from there into several other residential treatment programs. One of the evolutions in behavioral health care from when I started back in the late 80s was it's kind of like when I was a kid, the same doctor that delivered me set my broken collarbone and cured my skin rash.
Right.
And, he did everything.
Family
right?
doctor.
But my kids now have 740 doctors, right?
They're all specialists.
They specialize, the care specializes. And, the research and the evidence is there that shows that specialty of care yields a better result. Well, the same thing really happened over my 30 years in behavioral health care.
Okay.
In the beginning, everybody took anybody, and it was pretty uncommon back in the late 80s for the kids that we were treating to have more than one diagnosis. By the time I retired, we had got no kids that only had one diagnosis. They were dual diagnosed or triple diagnosed and on 1,700 meds by the time we got them. So, but the care started to specialize. So you were seeing, programs for behavior conduct kids, programs for kids with sexual addiction, programs for kids with substance abuse issues, programs for kids who suffered with depression and anxiety, or other, emotional disorders. And we had programs, across the continuum of care. So that's what we did.
Gotcha. So were there any self-doubts you fought with in that first year or two getting the business off the ground? Yeah,
I think that's always a part of it. I think that's something that just by our nature, I think there's an entity out there that wants to constantly fill your mind with doubt about what you can do. And at some point, I think you have to make a conscious decision to choose faith over fear in those situations and say, listen, if I believe in something strongly enough to act on it and I am committed to it, then I'm going to get the result that I'm after. But there are setbacks, along the way. There always are. I mean, part of the whole experience is fraught with opposition and trying to figure out how to overcome and deal with it. If it were easy, I think everybody would do it, But the reality is, there were times when we, I remember early on in the process, we decided we were going to expand our company. And so we replied to a request for proposal on a contract as an innovative alternative to secure care. And we bought a facility down in Mona. And, for us, it was like $140,000 to buy this facility, but it represented a lot of money to us at that time. And it was a fixed contract, which meant it would last for 3 years and then would renew. Well, we got into it and what ended up happening is that the people with the state who were administering the contract weren't happy, so they exercised a provision in the contract and canceled the contract.
Before it started?
Well, no, we were about a year down the road.
Okay,
but what that meant is here we are with this $140,000 facility,
and you're not filling it.
We don't have a revenue source, to pay it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I remember at the time thinking, what are we going to do? And I mean, so we just went in, sat down, and had a group process, talked about what the opportunities were, and applied for a different contract that served a different type of kid, and opened it back up and filled it up. And we launched our wilderness program out of that as well, which was our first private pay program. And that set the basis for, our growth and expansion over the next, what would end up being 27 years.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Do you feel like those times where you had to make those big decisions, do you feel like it was easier because you had partners in the business? For
sure. For me. Yeah, for sure. I had a sense of responsibility and duty to those guys that if it was just me, I might not have had the discipline to really execute on it. But, when you've got the responsibility for somebody else's back and that they've got yours, it provides a little bit of motivation to say, I'm not going to let my partners down. So you do things maybe that you might not do otherwise. Now, not everybody's wired that way. Some people are so motivated and have so much internal drive and ambition that they'll move the moon by themselves because they're that committed to it. But, for me, part of what was challenging about our business was, it was such an emotionally intense environment.
Yeah.
That when you're dealing with, the lives of kids and the lives of families, there's a lot of emotional intensity that comes with that. And there's a lot of risk and a lot of liability. And there are some times that, to have each other, through that process was incredibly valuable, because again, you had this support system built in and this band of brothers that if we were going to go down, we were going to go down swinging,
Yeah.
But, an interesting thing, Jace, about that whole thing is, as I was going to school at the Marriott School of Business at BYU, and it could have been I was sleeping during this lecture, but they never mentioned the concept of momentum in business, And as we got about 20 or so years into our business, it became really pretty easy to start a new program and get the money and everything that you have to do to do it. And I had an epiphany, that was like, well, in the beginning, had no momentum. And it took 10 units of effort to generate 1 unit of return. But over time, staying after it and staying focused and just keeping your head down and grinding it out, it got to the point where 1 unit of effort would generate 10 units of return. That's the concept of momentum in business.
That's interesting. I think that can probably be applied to life, right?
For sure.
To making good decisions, to fatherhood, to whatever you want to apply it to. Momentum is huge.
Yep.
I learned about momentum in 6th grade football from Coach Kelly.
I bet you did. Did.
Now that I'm looking back on it, I guess it's a life lesson from old Joe Kelly.
For sure.
So with these high emotions and in the business that you were in, I'm sure you saw a lot of hardship. Was it difficult to not take that home?
There were times that, it was really hard not to take it home. If we had a runner in the wilderness and it was 30 below zero and he was out at night, you're not sleeping. So it's pretty impossible not to take that home.
Yeah.
But the flip side of it is that, what I saw, at work over the years generally made me so grateful, for the situation that I had at home. I had a wife who had it locked down at home, and, I was so grateful for my kids, and we were involved in so many good things with good people. I had so many tools at my disposal to be a dad, to help my kids, to have a successful marriage, and that sort of stuff. That it was, in some ways, it was kind of like watching my dad struggle with alcohol made it easy for me to be committed to not ever tasting it.
Yeah.
And kind of watching some of the circumstances I saw, kids come out of kind of provided that same level of aversion for me, you know, to try to make sure that I didn't make some of those same mistakes that I saw people make.
Yeah. That's interesting. So explain to me just quickly what the wilderness program is, because from what I understand, you guys were one of the first companies to do it.
Well, it had been done before,
Okay.
but the wilderness program was really it was a treatment program that was set in the wilderness 365 days a year. You know, ours was an open enrollment, or what they called a continuous flow model, where, you know, parents would refer their kid and we would take them, and, you know, generally the program would last 60 to 70 days. They'd be out in the wilderness and they would learn a series of hard skills, you know, that were metaphors for life, you know, like building a bow drill fire, tying a tarp pack. I mean, that sort of stuff. And, you know, there was a therapist that went into the field multiple times a week. So they were having individual therapy and group therapy, you know, to address specific issues in their treatment plan. And so the program and the therapy worked together, you know, to provide the kid with a really challenging experience that hopefully at the end of that, he kind of had a fresh start at a second chance with his family and school and all that other stuff, you know.
So you're trying to break them, really. Break
well,
them down. Like,
I think, it's pretty tough. I think it's a natural product of the environment that they have some of those epiphanies.
Yeah.
And in reality, a lot of kids have been, they've been placated, you know, so much, and they've been, you know, they haven't had to do hard things, you know, and as a result of that, you know, we had a psychologist that termed it, you know, kids at some point decide to go on developmental vacation, you know, Doc Sanderson, you know, he says, like, when they turn 14, you know, they decide, I don't want to go any farther than this. I want to stay in the basement and play video games. I want to not go to school if I don't feel like it. I want to smoke weed with my friends. Yeah. And I want my parents to make up the difference between where I should be based on the fact that I'm 16 now and where I really am, which is 14. So that creates all these maladaptive dynamics inside of the home, you know, and the kids really running the show, and the parents, I mean, it's driving them crazy, you know, they don't know what to do. And it finally gets to a point where they realize, you know, we can't continue. And so they would place them. But, you know, it's become increasingly less desirable, and wilderness programs in general have had to soften their approach, you know, over time, just because parents have a really tough time now seeing their kids struggle. You know, they don't like the thoughts of, you know, how hard it is for them to live in the wilderness and that kind of thing. But in the end, you know, the unfortunate part of that is kids who have a true wilderness experience, the sense of fulfillment and achievement that they have because of that experience really provides them with the ego strength, you know, to take on a lot of challenges in life. And if there are cases where a kid's got significant enough mental health issues that they need further treatment, then there's specialty treatment after that in residential treatment, you know, that they can do, which can kind of help them continue to, you know, to get the help they need.
And so it's up to them how long they're out there. Is that right?
pretty much. I mean, it used to be under the old model. It was kind of like you finish the curriculum and you graduate the program. Okay. But, you know, with coordinating care, you know, aftercare following the wilderness, there are times that, you know, there's a lot of wilderness programs that kind of are placeholders where they take the kid and they do the best they can with them for, you know, 45 or 60 days until the program opens up in an RTC somewhere. And then sometimes they'll go. And I think that's really, I mean, it's kind of sad because they miss that opportunity for, you know, to be able to feel a sense of achievement for doing something hard. But it's kind of the way that the industry evolved.
That's kind of been a common theme on a few episodes here on the podcast is how do we encourage our kids or help them to do hard things? Yeah. What have you done, you know, because your kids aren't needing these programs and to go out in the wilderness. What have you done as a parent to make sure they gain that knowledge that they can do hard things?
Well, I think as a parent, you know, you have to have a certain level of clarity, you know, in terms of you need to have clarity around who your kids are, around who you are, around what your values are, around what principles you really believe in.
Yeah.
You have to have clarity around what your responsibility is for these little lives that you created. You have to have clarity around what tools you have at your disposal.
Yeah.
You need to have clarity around what is it that you want as an outcome for your kids? What's the end goal here? And so for me, I wish that I would have had that kind of clarity when I was a new dad, right?
Yeah, don't we all?
Yeah. But what we did is we were involved in a lot of sports. My kids were all multiple sport athletes, and we were committed to that, and we spent a lot of family time together. And I've always felt like the best thing that I can do as a parent is to raise a well-balanced, well-adjusted kid who is high character and high competence, or at least appropriate level of confidence.
Yeah.
You've got a toddler, right?
Yeah.
So would you let Lincoln cross a busy street by himself at this point?
No.
And why is that?
He's not capable.
Okay, he's not competent, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have anything to do with his character, but it has everything to do with his competence. Now fast forward and imagine your oldest child is a girl, and she's 14 years old, and the 18-year-old quarterback on the football team wants to take her to homecoming. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden the social pressure starts to come,
Yeah.
And if you and your wife aren't on the same page, I mean, you may have that to deal with. Well, I'm surprised at how obvious the analogy of a toddler crossing the road alone is, but how many people miss that other piece, which is a 14-year-old girl's not competent to be in that situation with an 18-year-old kid, right? Even if they're both good kids, it has nothing to do with character. It has everything to do with competence. And the reality is we're constantly in transition, right? When you transition from an infant to a toddler to a latency age kid to an adolescent to a young adult to a newly married guy to a new dad, like it's constant transition. And as parents, I think one of the things that we've got to be able to do is we've got to understand that our parenting styles have to transition as our children's development transitions. And, the best example I can think of is when my oldest son, Mitch, was getting ready to come home from a mission. Mitch was a good kid, but he drove us nuts in high school sometimes. We never knew where he was. We never, a lot of this kind of stuff. And, you're keeping your fingers crossed, hoping he's doing good things, but you don't really know. Well, he was getting ready to come home from his mission, and Jan and I were talking about him coming home, and she started down this path. Well, when he gets home, she started to lay out this parenting strategy with him. And I was like, wait a minute, honey, he's 21. I mean, He's an adult.
Yeah.
We can't parent him like he was a teenager. Now we can take it out on Parker and Carson, who are still teenagers, but we have to transition our parenting style with him. And I'll tell you, the relationship that you have with your adult children, if you've just done your best and they know that you love them and you've tried to teach them the right things, I mean, they're incredibly rewarding to see, okay, they're pretty well balanced and they're pretty well adjusted.
Yeah.
Do
you feel like it's I've always been interested on that topic of like feeling that reward of, me and my wife and I parenting and doing our best and struggling for the next 20 years. Like, I like to think about that reward. Like, how much of a reward is, like, explain that to me. Do you sit back and you look at your adult kids and you're like proud, or what goes through your mind? Well,
I think the sense of responsibility that you have for raising good kids, you just feel it. It's a mantle that, and when there comes a time that you can let go and they're running their own life, they're financially independent, they're gainfully employed, they're in a good marriage, they've got kids of their own,
right,
that you feel a little bit of that weight lift off, and all of a sudden you're not feeling like you're responsible for how they turn out. You're able to enjoy how they turned out, and so I think it's that. But the other part of it, I would say, is when you get to where I am, you're going to look back and you're going to long for some of those days, man. I mean, we wrestled all over the country, right? I mean, from Denver to Reno to Montana to Vegas,
Yep.
you know, those road trips with, you know, 8, 10-year-old boys, you know, and that whole experience, you know, having your kid go out and lay an egg, not wrestle well, but having one of the other dads give you a little bit of therapy, you know, because your kid didn't do really well, or vice versa. You know, those kinds of experiences, you know, they're done for me.
Yeah.
But they're just starting for you.
Yeah.
And you're not trying to raise state champions. You're trying to raise good kids. You're trying to raise well-balanced, well-adjusted, character-oriented, competent kids.
Yeah. Why, you know, when you committed to coming and doing this episode, I was at the gym and I was wondering about what we were going to talk about, and I wanted to bring up the glory days of the 15 passenger van, you know, and heading out on those road trips, because I learned a lot about life on those road trips, hanging out with my dad and his friends and the older boys like Hayden Peterson, you know, and all them. I learned a lot. I feel like from that time to my senior year, the sport of wrestling really shaped who I am. Yeah. You know? Yeah. So, that time just bonding, you know, like being with guys and being with your dad and seeing how he acts around other men. I don't know. It was special.
I think there's no escaping, you know, the impact of mentoring or modeling, you know, and I think back on, you know, those experiences together and, you know, the way that we interacted, you know, with each other as adults, with our kids, you know, the values that we had, you know, our kids didn't see us doing things that were not consistent, you know, with what we believed. And everybody that was on the trip knew what we believed and knew who we were. And, you know, then to go to a tournament and, you know, have a pretty emotional experience sometimes, you know, if a match didn't go the way you wanted it to, and figuring out how you're going to interact with your kid, pick them up and get them ready to go again. I mean, the life lessons in that they're multiple. There are just so many of them. You know, now you're going to be able to see it from the other side of that. Yeah. You know, and have a chance to improve on what you think Joe should have done better.
Yeah. Well, thinking about that, I'm like, I know the commitment it is on a parent to really take the sport seriously. Yeah. And I'll admit there is a small part of me that's like, man, am I ready to make that commitment? Yeah. Financially, time-wise, emotionally. Like, my wife asks me probably once a year, because she jumped into the sport when she married into the Kelly family. Right. And she's like, man, are we ready to commit to this? What did you do as a father to push your kids, and, you know, when they wanted to quit?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jason. It's one that every dad's got to face, you know, because you have those people on one side who are going to say, you know, I'm going to let my kid make their own decisions from the time that they're young. They're going to do what they want to do. And I'm like, well, I'll be seeing you. You'll be writing me a big check to treat your kid then, you know. But then on the other hand, they're the hardcores who, you know, whose kids have no choice. And then as soon as they're done with wrestling, they got nothing. Like that's all they knew. They don't know how to build a bridge between what they learned there. So I think that you have to, in the absence of an opportunity to raise a kid on a farm and teaching the things that come there, you have to find a metaphor or a tool that works. Yeah. And sports, fortunately, does that. I mean, there are lots of things that do, but certainly sports from a physical standpoint in particular, and wrestling for sure. You know, I mean, nothing teaches responsibility for personal preparation like stepping out onto a mat, going hand to hand with another guy, and either having the agony of defeat or the thrill of victory after that, right? Yep. You know, when you're done with that match, you remember every sprint that you dogged. You remember every go that you didn't give it your best. Like those things are plastered in your mind. So I think for me, I always recognize that success in all sports really boiled down to three things: intensity, technique, and conditioning. And so I would try not to get too emotional, but I would try to have that conversation with my kids at some point, like, okay, where are we off? You know, was it an intensity issue and you just weren't ready to go? Was it a conditioning issue and that you just gassed in the third and gave up a lead and lost? Was it a technique issue? Did that kid just hit you with some stuff that you didn't know? And really being able to have a framework to do some self-evaluation and try and get your kids see it that way kind of removes some of the emotion of it. But it's a hard sport. And there were times that my boys were like, I don't want to wrestle. I don't want to go to this tournament this weekend. And so we'd take tournaments off every once in a while. But I realized if I let them make the decision always, that like most kids, they're going to choose a path of least resistance, which isn't necessarily better for them. And so I didn't let them choose the path of least resistance. The other thing I think is kind of critical as it relates to sports or anything else, I think there's a progression from interest to passion to excellence. I think that it has to follow that track. Kids are interested in everything, right? I mean, everything.
Yeah.
But it's not until they become passionate about it that they are willing to make the sacrifices that they need to become excellent. And I think kids who identify that, and whether it's music or sports or whatever it is, they have a different challenge, because it's very easy for that kind of a kid to lose balance in his life in the other areas, right? He's an incredible wrestler, but socially he's not super adept, or, maybe he doesn't really develop academically the way that he needs to, or he doesn't really care about his spiritual development. And I don't care what religion you are, we are 4-dimensional beings, and your spirituality has to fit into the equation of personal development somewhere.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking through my head that step process. So what I'm thinking is, to take that step from interest to passion, the kid needs to experience some wins.
Yep.
They need to see where their effort went and why they won, and be able to look back and see those wins. Am I right? Does that make sense?
I think it's a competitive landscape, and that's the metric that matters in a lot of ways. I just think as a parent, you have to be careful about making it about that, right? Like somehow, the wrestling world in particular is littered with dads whose kids were dynamite world beaters as kids, but they were so disgusted and fed up with it by the time that they got into high school that they bailed, because it was always about the win, or the loss. And there's got to be some joy in it. A kid's got to find some other sense of satisfaction in it other than just the wins and the losses, Yeah. He's got to enjoy the 15-passenger van ride and, one kid peeing on the radiator while everybody's getting stunk out in the back, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true. So as a father, with your career, building a business, your marriage, church callings, kids, and sports, how did you balance all that? And do you feel like you made time for yourself?
I think it's a challenge, especially at different phases of your life. Balance is just, it's flat a challenge, right?
Yeah.
And I think for me, through most of that period of time, my health is probably where the compromise was. I got too heavy. I had some issues with my heart health and, some other stuff. And, since retiring and life kind of settling down, getting released from significant callings and, all of that sort of stuff, I've been more focused on trying to have some balance and, trying to, be healthier and to exercise and do the things that I should. But, I felt like for me, I knew that I had a closing window. Jan and I, we were going to take the kids to Disneyland this one year, and it was in the spring, and the weather was nice, and we'd been planning this trip, and we loaded them all up in the Suburban, and we got 5 of them, and we get headed down the canyon from our house, and they are fighting within 100 yards leaving the house. They're fighting. And I'm like, 10 hours of this? I don't think I can do it. And as we drive by Brent Butler's house, he was the stake president at the time. He was out in the yard watering his yard. And I pulled the car over and I said, I'm telling President Butler how you kids are acting. And I stopped and rolled the windows down, and he came over to the car. Of course, they were all perfect at that time.
Yeah.
And he looked in the car, and he looked at the kids, and he looked at Jan and I, and he said, these are the best times of your life, and they'll be over before you know it. You know? And I said, well, that's funny because they don't feel like it. I stopped to tell on these kids. They were fighting. Yeah. We're going to Disneyland. And we're 100 yards from the house. And he's like, oh, these are the best times of your life, you know. And I can tell you now, man, it went by like that. And, you know, I think you do the best you can because you have a closing window, and where some things are going to have to give, and you're going to have to learn to say no to some things, right? You're going to have to say no to some things that you really maybe want to say yes to, but you have to maintain balance, and you have to maintain priority, and you have to maintain focus on those things that matter most.
Yeah. What scares me, you know, just through doing research and studying topics about, you know, starting this podcast and bringing guests on, what scares me is I think most good men, good fathers, when something needs to give, it's them. It's their mental health.
Yeah.
Or their physical health, you know. Yeah. I think most good men will always put that extra effort into being financially stable and making sure their wife and kids are good.
Yeah.
And what sacrifices them.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that is a choice, and I think women make that same choice in a lot of instances as well.
Absolutely.
You know, and so it's no wonder that, you know, now what's the backbone of the young men's and young women's program is balanced personal development. You know, and it's that way for a reason. It's because, you know, we have a generation of kids kids and parents who have turned things like normal anxiety into a disorder, right? Yeah. And we've lost this to some degree, not everybody. We've lost this ability to, you know, to have enough grit to be able to push through things that are hard, you know. Yeah. And if we feel something that's uncomfortable, I mean, instead of saying, oh, I'm anxious, well, that's because your mind and your body are telling you you're about to do something you've never done before, or something really hard.
Yeah.
So get ready. We say, oh, we don't want you to feel anxious. That you must have an anxiety disorder. Let's go to the doctor and let's get some medication so you don't have to feel that way. Well, feeling that way, we have to feel all kinds of stuff we don't want to feel.
Yeah.
You know, and there's not always an easy way out of that.
And they're doing it at a young age.
Yeah. Yeah.
And those people are going to, what happens in 20, 30, 40 years, and they're parents, you know, and I don't know, it's scary. What's an unexpected lesson that you've learned in the last 10 years of fatherhood?
I think one for sure is just how much you can love and adore grandkids. I mean, I knew that. I was really fond of my nephews and nieces and stuff, but man, I mean, that's one unexpected lesson, you know, over the last 10 years that I've learned about being a father. Another one, you know, honestly, was probably when Jan was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2020. You know, Carson was on a mission in New Jersey. The pandemic was breaking out, so he was locked down. So it wasn't like he was going to be able to go out and grind it out and get his mind off of it, you know. And, you know, our other kids were all off on their life. I'd just been released from the stake presidency, and we had to get them together and tell them, you know, your mom's got breast cancer. We don't know exactly. It wasn't a garden variety type. It was one that was going to be a bit of a challenge to treat. You know, how difficult that was to see their fear and their pain as they had to face that reality. Yeah. And you've been there, you know, you had to do it as a little kid, you know, as a younger kid. But that was something that, you know, that was a surprise how hard that was, because they had all kinds of assumptions about why we'd called them together. None of it had to do with, you know, that.
Yeah.
So that was something. You know, one of the things over the last 10 years that I've learned is, you know, as I've matured and I've figured some things out about myself and the way that I grew up and what I saw and why I am the way that I am, as I kind of work through those things, how it translates into me having a deeper love and appreciation for my wife and the kind of person that she is. And, you know, that's been another one, you know, that I didn't really expect to be figuring out at, you know, 55, 56, 57, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
So
did you feel pressure to be the rock of the family during those times?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. And, I was incredibly fortunate. I'd just retired.
Yeah.
So I didn't have to go to work. I got released from a stake presidency at that time. And so, the demands of that calling, were gone. And I really was able just to say, I'm here to take care of you. What do we got to do? Let's fight this thing together. But, then the pandemic kicked in and I couldn't go in the chemo room with her anymore.
Yeah.
But, it didn't matter because by the second time in, she'd made friends with,
no, I'm sure.
Everybody in the room. She didn't really have much need for me. She'd say, honey, I'm good. You got me settled. You can go to Home Depot or whatever. Just come back in 3 hours when I'm done, that kind of thing. So
there's something special in being there for your spouse and helping them through that suffering. I think it grows your love for each other.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure.
I'm sure that was a special time for your family to be able to see that struggle and push through it.
Yeah, and I think probably, nobody's going to choose that.
No.
Nobody's going to choose to go through that. And nobody's going to choose the aftermath of what happens after you go through that. But I think there is an opportunity, even in the midst of those hardships and trials, for your kids to learn from you, from how you navigate that, and where do you draw strength from at that point,
Yeah.
Are you bitter or are you grateful? Are you grateful that you don't have somebody else's challenge? Because they're worse. Even if you've got a cancer diagnosis, somebody's got it worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Somebody's got a cancer diagnosis and they're doing it alone.
Yeah.
Or somebody's got a cancer diagnosis and they don't have the resource to get help, So, lots of choices to be made in the midst of that kind of situation.
So as you reflect back on your life, do you feel like your personality and the way you perceive yourself has continued to develop, or have you settled into who you are?
Oh man, I think we're constantly in a state of evolution. I think if you just look at, the need to reinvent yourself professionally every 3 to 5 years if you want to stay relevant, that's a factor. I think we are so geared and wired to make progress, to learn and to grow. It's in our nature. And so for me, I think understanding who you are and being secure about your identity in a world where identity crisis is pandemic, right? I think it's critical, but also understanding that I don't have to be perfect today and I'm a work in progress and I'm going to continue to pursue the interests that I have, and I'm going to try and develop new skills and new capacities so that I can do some good for somebody. I can do some good for my kids. I can do some good for my grandkids. I can do some good for my neighbors. That only happens if you're evolving and you're developing.
Yeah, I love that. Well, to wrap up this podcast, I ask all my guests the same question at the end of the episode, and that is, if there's one lesson that you want to leave your children when you're no longer here, what is that lesson?
I think probably first and maybe most preeminent is that they're sons and daughters of heavenly parents who love them and who know them. I think if they knew that and every decision that they made was guided by the fact that they had that kind of divine heritage, I think it would help them make good choices in a lot of the cases. The other thing, I have been deeply affected by what I would call the psychology of achievement types of literature that's out there, As a Man Thinketh by James Allen or 7 Habits by Covey, or, there's a ton of good stuff out there, that just opens your mind and helps you believe I can really do whatever I want in life. I have the ability to have what I want, to do what I want, to be what I want to some degree. And I just have to choose a path that aligns with that outcome that I'm after. And, that fundamental paradigm shift happened to me, when I was on a mission, when I was 20 years old, and I never looked back. I continued to pursue that and put things into my mind that made me more free, not things that made me less free.
Yeah.
That created self-doubt and limited who I could become.
Yeah.
You know, and I think I would hope that my kids would do that and get a sense of the world is mine. I can do and accomplish what I want in this world. You know?
I love it. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for being here and sharing your experiences and knowledge.
My pleasure, man. It's been awesome. Congratulations on the podcast.
Thank you.
And good luck.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep.